Hello everyone, welcome back once again to Gammabox. My name's Jack Carr and this one is a little bit special. Normally I'm joined by Tom Hunter and we discuss all things new in the world of Microsoft Teams, but here at Gamma we like to stay on the pulse. We like to know what our customers are interested in and to provide as much information about that as possible. And I think it goes without saying that one of the most pressing concerns industry-wide at the moment is around cybersecurity. Now, to help me out with that, we've brought in an expert. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast Hisham, one of our Microsoft security specialists. Hisham, thanks for being here. First of all, could we know a little bit more about you and what you do?
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Hisham. I've been a Microsoft guy for over 30 years, actually. I've only joined Gamma just over 6 months ago. I've been delivering consultancy as well as training on Microsoft platforms and application servers for the whole of my professional life, really. In the last 15 years, I've been focusing on Microsoft cloud technology specifically. And obviously, I've seen Teams, since we're talking about Teams today, evolving. And, from the days of the Office communication server, some of us might not be old enough to remember that. And then through all the iterations of like Skype for Business server on-prem and then Skype for Business online until Teams, which is what we've been having for the last few years. So yeah, this is me in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. I think probably a sensible place to start off with would be just discussing some of the built-in capabilities around cybersecurity when you look at Microsoft Teams itself.
Of course. So Teams is quite a special application, I have to say. It's a bit like an octopus with like tentacles all over the Microsoft 365 suite. So interestingly, when you create a Microsoft Teams team, it does create a SharePoint site. It does get itself into Microsoft Exchange Online as well. It actually creates a mailbox in there, as well as OneDrive. Gets involved with the whole picture. And if you do get involved, which is actually what we do at Gamma, if you do get involved with the phone system kind of component of Teams as well, we're talking about kind of enterprise voice capabilities that Teams gets involved with as well. So it's really indeed like an octopus, tentacles all over the Microsoft 365 space. And that in itself can introduce risks, right? If it's based on SharePoint and Exchange and OneDrive, that means the attack surface, if you like, is a little bit more kind of widened, which means there's a lot we might need to do in order to secure our kind of interaction with Teams.
Yeah, and to pick up on one thing that you said there, I find it really interesting, is typically when we look at our customer base, anyone who's invested in Microsoft Teams as an internal estate, that's never really standalone. If you're utilizing Teams as an organization, there's a very good chance, if not an almost certainty, that you are invested in the wider Microsoft ecosphere, if you like that. How does that play into Teams related security when you look at it sort of as a bigger picture?
Indeed, and probably Teams more than anything else, right? Is not running in isolation, definitely. So we can start by looking at the underlying directory structure that Teams is based on. So in Microsoft Cloud, we have Microsoft Entra ID now, used to be called Azure AD, which is the starting point of interacting with Teams. People have to sign into Teams, and technically when they sign into Teams, they sign into the underlying directory service, which is Entra ID. So to start with identity security and how we can secure how people authenticate, who is authenticating, are they the right people, verifying their credentials, Teams can very much leverage things like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, conditional access, all of what Microsoft Entra ID can provide to ensure we have the right people on our meetings, the right guests as well, participating with us in our teams and accessing the data that we share. So this is, a very important really starting point and an important source of risk as well if we don't get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there when you talk about signing into Teams. When was the last time you actually signed into Teams, right? It nearly never happens because it's part of that wider platform environment, right? And you touched on it briefly there around access and, making sure that you've got the right policies in place. But policies are one of those things where you only really notice them when you don't have them or you have them, but they're maybe not quite right. Could you talk us through, some of the things to keep in mind when looking at policies and making sure you're doing it with best practice in mind?
Absolutely. So when we talk about policies, I think we can break this down into two types. We have policies within teams and policies within the Microsoft 365 platform in general that do affect teams. So within teams, we have policies governing many of the team's capabilities. We have meeting policies, messaging policies, the actual apps that you can add within any team's team or channel, right? How we can govern which apps can be added, whether we should be allowing third-party apps, for example, that might not necessarily be trusted, or whether we just allow Microsoft apps to be added into the teams. So we have many different types of policies. And again, if we also start involving phone system and enterprise voice, there are also policies that apply to this area. Policies apply to audio conferencing as well, which is something we get very much involved with. So you have many sorts of policies within teams that can govern or help us govern the team's capabilities. We have policies that are generally global, but we can also configure granular policies within teams that apply to different groups of people within the organization. So that's all the first type, right? Besides that, we have the policies that are, that we are inheriting from the wider Microsoft 365 space, whether security-related policies or compliance-related policies. Yeah. So security-related policies involve things like the content that we share within teams. So we have a Microsoft Defender capability called MGO, Microsoft Defender for Office 365, that provide us with the ability to secure access to links that can be shared within Teams chats and Teams conversations, links that could be, they could introduce risk to our environment, like phishing links, for example, or links to malware or unauthorized websites. This is one thing. We call this capability safe links, part of MDO. We also have safe attachments, right? Users unintentionally, unknowingly perhaps, sharing content that could include malware within the teams, right? So we have a Microsoft Defender component, MGO, that can help us protect against that. And that very much applies to teams. So besides MGO, we have many other Microsoft Defender components that so much apply to teams. One of the ones I can think of right now is the Defender for Cloud Apps, Teams itself being a cloud app, in itself, and how Defender for Cloud Apps can protect against unusual, suspicious, unauthorized Teams activities. Like, for example, if you have a guest joining one of our teams, we have a lot of data, a lot of content within the team specifically, and that guest is attempting to do like mass downloads or mass extraction of data, from the teams. Defender for Cloud Apps can capture and can address that through the policies that we can configure, for example, right? We have other Defender components like Defender for Identity. We talked about identity a minute ago, and Defender for Identity can once again be used to help us address Teams identity verification and authorization issues. And actually, that reminds me of an important security principle that very much applies to team here, which is the zero trust principle. How we should always be verifying anyone who is attempting to authenticate our environment, authenticate our teams in this case. How we should always be using least privilege principle to ensure that users are only getting the minimum rights required to do their job. And the third principle really is assume breach, right? The fact that we shouldn't, not just because we don't have alarm bells all over the place, that we should assume that we have not been breached. A lot of bad actors could have infiltrated our environment, but they could be laying low, gathering information, doing reconnaissance, doing espionage, before they actually, make their hit. So all of these tools in Microsoft Defender XDR can very much help us protect our environment, our users when they're using Teams.
No, I think they're all really, really good points to bring up. One of the things that we are asked pretty frequently, particularly in formal procurement exercises, and it's something that is very much top of mind at the moment, is around compliance and regulation regarding your data. I think it's probably fair to say that it's never really been more important than right now that you are on top of your compliance and regulations regarding your data. How can we ensure that we are providing the appropriate level of governance when you look at a team's estate?
Indeed. And Microsoft has been investing a lot lately in its Purview platform, which is where you can very much manage data compliance, data security. So a lot of the components in Purview apply to teams. So whether, for example, data loss prevention that we can use to ensure that data does not leak through Teams conversations, through Teams, chats and files, especially if you have people outside the environment who are interacting with us within our teams, like guests, for example, that are part of our teams. So DLP is a big thing, right, that we can use. The data classification and the protection using sensitivity labels, for example. So this very much applies to Teams as well. You can very much label content within Teams as sensitive. If you are sharing health, records, for example, like in our case in the NHS, within Teams. If you are sharing financial information like bank account details, credit card details, and so on. If you are sharing some personal information like, passport numbers and national insurance number and so on, all of that can be, secured. It can be labeled using sensitivity labels within Teams. And accordingly, we can, protect that content from, first of all, leaking outside the environment or from being manipulated in ways that can breach our security, one thing, but also, that wouldn't adhere to the regulations that are kind of, imposed on our industry that we are part of or the business that we are, part of. There's a lot more really within the Purview platform that also applies to team. Retention is another thing, right? And indeed, retention very much, it is very much related to compliance. In perhaps the NHS, for example, there could be, regulations that require us to retain health records for a certain period of time. In the financial sector, we could also have similar, requirements to retain content for a certain period of time. For GDPR perspectives or reasons, we can also be required to retain content. So retention policies, retention labels that we can use from within the Purview platform in Microsoft 365 can very much apply to Teams as well. Teams chats, Teams conversations, files that are shared within the Teams environment can very much also be subjected to the retention capabilities that we have in Purview.
I think it's a really good point, and it kind of leans into the idea of this Microsoft vision, right? That Teams itself is an application, and there are things inside of it, but it's almost like a window pane into the wider Microsoft estate, so things like your SharePoint. And I guess the benefit is that some of the things you were talking about there, if you maintain best practice across your Microsoft estate, you don't really need to adapt your approach too much when you look at Teams. It's all based on the same principles of access and retention and all that good stuff, right? You don't need to radically change your approach because, the Teams part of your estate handles data in this way and the rest of Microsoft handle it in another way. It's a very much a shared vision and a shared approach on how you manage your data. And having it there and looked after in the proper way is one thing, but, often we get asked about tracking processes and audit trails. How much can we give our customers in regards to that and what's actually happening to their data once it has been stored and created?
That's a very important point. And indeed, it is one of the other Purview capabilities that we have, which is very simply called the audit capability. And it is one of the main ones that feed into all the other Purview capabilities. So initially, if you've just provisioned a new Microsoft 365 environment, audit is not actually at all enabled by default. And the main reason for that is in some countries, in some environments, I know Germany, tends to be a little bit fussy about that, about privacy, right?
Yeah.
And when we enable the audit capability in Purview, we immediately start capturing weird number of activities that users are performing within the environment, right? I was talking to a customer just a few days ago, and they were asking about what activities do we pick up using audit, right? And he was a little bit surprised when I said way more than you can imagine, right? And I actually took him through the audit activities, and we kept scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, looking at all sorts of activities that get picked up by the audit capability within Purview. But then it's not just about auditing activities and being able to search who did what, when, where, but it's how this information feeds into the other Purview components, like the DLP we were talking about, but also like something like insider risk management. One of the things we might not have discussed yet, and one of the things that customers are not looking at that much yet, is risks arising from within our environment, insider risks. And it is something that Microsoft has looked at a lot in the last few years. They've invested a lot in developing the insider risk management capability in order for us to get an insight into what's happening within our environment, what risks are arising from either employees within the environment or maybe visitors, contractors who are coming to help us do some work, and then how we can address those risks. And auditing very much feeds into that. All the audit information we capture feeds into our insights with regards to insider risks.
I think it's a really good point. And just to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned there, I mean, whether it be the worker type scenario, so whether that's a fixed term employee, full-time worker, or whether it's a contractor who's maybe acting as a pseudo external participant, or the example of, maybe a cultural difference in terms of data privacy. So, for example, the UK versus Germany, we know there are some differences there in terms of what's acceptable to track and monitor. Can we use the tools to maybe tailor our approach so that, maybe we look at different user pools in a different way, depending on how much data we want to track and audit from different use cases?
Indeed. And that could be done in different ways. So one of the ways we can do that is by using and acquiring the correct license, with regards to our business requirements. So for example, the audit capability we were just talking about, it is available in standard tier as well as in, premium tier. And in the standard tier, you are able to keep audit tracks for only up to 6 months, whereas with the premium tier, the default is up to 1 year, so double what you can with standard. But in addition to that, you can also use retention policies to keep data for up to 10 years. So if you are an organization who is required, perhaps because of regulatory requirements, if you are required to keep data, including audit tracks, for a longer period of time, something like the audit premium can help with that. So this is one point. But the other point as well is that in many areas within Purview, you can actually anonymize the reports, the audit information to serve, people like, the businesses in Germany, for example, who are really, really fussy about privacy. And I had a lot of conversation with them. Every time we talk about any report that shows usernames, the guys in Germany, freak out immediately. They know that their privacy policy, wouldn't allow usernames to show up in reports. And that is something we can very much address in here using the anonymization of, usernames and being able to generate reports that wouldn't actually show the actual usernames performing those activities.
I mean, that's really good to hear. And what I'm taking away from that is that we very much have the tools available to meet our requirements for what we actually need a security platform to do. But just to kind of bring it back on a final point to the people behind the platform, so our end users, it's a sensitive thing, right? I mean, you mentioned it earlier, things like phishing scams, that kind of thing. Anybody who has been caught out on such a thing, it's a little bit embarrassing. You hate having to kind of self-report after the fact that, maybe I clicked on this thing, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And it's not a great position to be in. how can we help and ensure our users keep not only themselves safe, but also the wider organization?
Yes, many of the capabilities we've been talking about do interact with users directly. So I talked about retention labels, for example, right? Something that we can use to label content within Teams for retention purposes. Retention labels do interact with users directly. Sensitivity labels, also I talked about that as a way of highlighting which content within Teams or within the wider Microsoft 365 environment is sensitive enough to be dealt with in a certain way, is sensitive enough not to leak within outside the organization, and is sensitive enough to be protected and encrypted within our organization. All of these capabilities interact with users directly. And I always say that to customers, I always say, you really have to involve your users. First of all, with regards to the communication that you share with them about the adoption of such capabilities, with regards to the training and the readiness you need to ensure that your organization has. And that also helps a lot with addressing resistance to change. Okay? So if users are not used to using labels to retain content, using labels to secure content, if users are not aware of the social engineering, risks that they could experience, then when you start introducing something new to them, they would show a lot of resistance to that. But if you involve them from the beginning through communication, through training and readiness, through also kind of decision making. I mean, a lot of the policies that we can implement in our experience work best when you involve users in that. So for example, if you do like a pilot rollout of a certain capability, you collect feedback from the users, you empower them to help you, deploy the best policies that can fit with our environment. That usually ends up, with us having the best results.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing. I mean, I entirely agree with you that if you force a change on anybody, and it's not, it doesn't need to be cybersecurity specific, it doesn't even need to be technology specific. If you force a change on someone without explaining why, without explaining, the rationale behind why we're doing that, without getting any feedback from them or their opinions on it, it is always going to be more difficult. But I totally agree that if you can empower them to help form part of that process, you get buy-in, you get champions, you get people who are going to back you and, hopefully spread that message around the wider business.
Absolutely.
Well, Hisham, I'm by no means a cyber expert. I look at Microsoft Teams as a collaboration and calling platform primarily. So I've come away from this learning quite a lot. So thank you for that, and thank you for being with us. And we hope you have learned a lot too. For more details, please check out the Gamma website. Thank you once again, Hisham, and we'll see you soon.